The crystal chandelier of Maison Verdun spilled down a light the color of aged honey, and beneath it 2 women were being forced, step by step, toward the door. "I've told you already you don't belong here." Gerald Fenwick's voice was smooth as oil, and deliberately loud enough for the entire room to hear. "And you too, Rourke. Step aside right now, unless you'd like to lose your job tonight." But the young woman did not step aside. She stood planted between the manager and the silver-haired old woman, her arms slightly outstretched, her wine-colored apron still carrying the faint smell of coffee from the morning shift. "She hasn't done anything wrong," she said. Her voice trembled, but her feet did not retreat a single inch. She only wanted a table. "That's all." The old woman said nothing. She only held the worn tin box tighter against her chest. A box tied with a ribbon that the years had faded, as though it were the one thing still holding her upright in the middle of this storm. Across the room, one phone after another rose quietly above the tables. 10, then 15 glowing screens turned toward them. Not one person stood up. Not one person spoke. Somewhere in a shadowed corner, someone let out a soft laugh, the kind of laugh people reserve for a cheap spectacle. And no one in that glittering room paid any attention to the man who had just stepped through the revolving brass door. He was in no hurry. He drew off his leather gloves, slowly, one finger at a time, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the 2 women by the door. There was something in his stillness that made the nearest waiter take an involuntary step back. Without knowing why, no one knew who he was. No one knew that every tile beneath their heels, every crystal glass gleaming on the tables, even the brass sign above the door, all of it belonged to him. And no one could have guessed that he would cross those rows of white-draped tables, cross the sound of forks and knives falling still, walk straight to the old woman trembling with the tin box in her arms, stop before her and speak a single word, hoarse and broken, that silenced the entire restaurant. "Mom, have you ever stood in silence, watching something wrong unfold right before your eyes, quietly waiting for someone else to be brave enough to speak in your place? Stay until the end of this story. Because before this night is over, every single person who raised a phone in that room will have to face that very question." But to understand how a single word, "Mom," could shake an entire empire, we must go back 3 hours, to when the afternoon was still strangely, gently calm. If Ruth's story touched something in you tonight, please leave a like. Share it with someone who needs reminding that kindness still exists. And subscribe to our channel because there are many more stories like this one still waiting to be told. 3 hours earlier, the late afternoon sunlight was still laying a soft golden sheen across the sidewalks of Carrollton Avenue in New Orleans. Bus number 7 came to a stop at the corner with a faint sigh of brakes, and Ruth Delacroix stepped down with the careful gait of a woman who had spent long years teaching her knees how to endure. She was 61 years old. One hand rested on a wooden cane worn smooth and glossy by time, while the other held a small tin box tightly against her chest. The road from the far side of the city to this place had felt much longer to her than anything shown on a map, but she had traveled every inch of it without a single word of complaint. She paused on the sidewalk and lifted her eyes to the brass sign mounted on the red brick wall. Maison Verdun. The gilded letters curved with proud elegance beneath the evening light. Ruth stood perfectly still for a long while, because she knew this wall. She knew this brick foundation, no matter how many fresh coats of paint and how much money people had laid over it. 32 years ago, this place hadn't carried such a grand name. It had only been a little diner called Dabney's, with vinyl flooring frayed at the edges, red cushioned chairs faded from thousands of bodies sitting in them, and a flickering neon sign that blinked all night beside a window clouded with steam. 32 years ago, right here in this very spot, a 29-year-old woman had stood behind the counter every night, carrying heavy trays of food until her feet went numb and lost all feeling. Then, dragging herself back to the cramped rented room, where her little boy slept deeply, waiting for his mother. That woman had been her. Back then, her husband had left when the child wasn't yet 2 years old. He walked out the door on a rainy morning and never came back, leaving her with a small child, a stack of unpaid bills, and a loneliness no words could ever fully name. She had decided to keep her son's last name as Delacroix, her own name, not the name of the father who had turned his back, but the name of the bloodline that had stayed and carried everything. The boy grew up through the nights when she was away from home, raised on scattered tip money and hurried lullabies, before she put on her coat and went back out again. Every night at Dabney's, after she had wiped down the last table, she dropped every small coin and folded bill of tip money into a tin box, the very box she was holding now. It had followed her through 3 moves, through winters without enough warmth and summers without enough food, through all the years when she thought she couldn't possibly take one more step into another day. And yet she did keep walking, because her son was growing day by day beneath the poor roof they called home. Today was her son's birthday. The little boy from those years was now 34 years old, and for the first time in her entire life, Ruth wanted to treat him with her own hands to a truly proper dinner, in a place that was truly beautiful. She had been scrimping and saving for this moment for many months. She had chosen this very place on purpose, the exact place where she had once served others when she was still young, because she wanted her son to see one thing, that his old mother, the woman who had once waited tables in this shabby little diner, could now lift her head high and walk in through the front door. She hadn't told him a single word in advance. She wanted to give him a complete surprise, wanted to see the wonder on his face when he realized his mother was sitting there waiting for him at a table covered in white linen. She lifted her thin fingers, rough and calloused from years of labor, and gently brushed them over the lid of the box, tracing the faded ribbon. Inside that tin box was something she hadn't shown a single soul through all those long years, not even her only son. She had told herself that tonight would be the night she opened it, and gave her son the thing she had kept hidden for almost an entire lifetime. 3 blocks away, in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building, Della Rourke was kneeling to tie the shoelace of her little boy. She was 29 years old, her brown hair hastily tied back at the nape of her neck, and her face already carried the kind of exhaustion worn by women who shoulder everything alone, the kind of exhaustion that never gets enough sleep. Toby, her 4-year-old son, was holding up a sheet of paper in front of his mother, covered with clumsy colored pencil strokes. It was a drawing of a brown-haired woman holding hands with a little boy, with a bright yellow sun above them and rays spreading out in every direction. He said it was the 2 of them, mother and son, and he wanted her to take the picture to work so she wouldn't miss him so much. Della took the paper, folded it very carefully, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat right beside her heart. Then she promised him that tonight, when she came home, no matter how late it was, she would read him the rest of the story about the brave little rabbit that they hadn't finished yet. The boy smiled, a smile missing one baby tooth, and that tiny hug from him was the only thing that still gave Della enough strength to walk out the door each day. She took Toby to the kind neighbor at the end of the hallway, the woman who often watched him on the evenings when Della had to work. On her way down the stairs, her hand slipped into her pocket and touched another piece of paper, the one she had been trying to forget all day. It was the rent notice, folded into quarters, already 5 days overdue. The bold letters at the bottom of the page warned that if she didn't pay within the week, they would be forced to take action. She shoved the paper deep into the bottom of her pocket, as though doing that might make the burden a little lighter, but she knew it was still there, still pressing down on her chest every time she breathed. Della worked 2 jobs just to make it through each month. During the day, she stood behind the counter at a small coffee shop across the street, and as soon as her morning shift ended, she hurried over to Maison Verdon for the evening shift. The restaurant had only recently changed ownership, and she had just been taken on for a trial period a few weeks ago. To her, this job wasn't only about wages. It was milk money for Toby, rent for their small apartment, the fragile line between mother and child still having a roof over their heads, and the 2 of them ending up on the street. She couldn't lose it, not at any cost. The restaurant manager, Gerald Fenwick, had never once allowed her to forget how fragile that line was. That afternoon, just as she had finished tying the wine-colored apron behind her back, he had blocked her at the kitchen doorway, his shirt cuffs adjusted with perfect precision, his eyes measuring her from head to toe in a way she knew far too well. He said that table number 6 had complained that the soup had been served slowly, and that he didn't want to hear one more complaint during her shift. He reminded her, in a voice sweet and cold, that she was still on probation, and that there was a long line of people ready to take her place by tomorrow morning if she disappointed him. Della only lowered her head and answered yes, keeping her voice as flat and quiet as possible, because she had learned long ago that with men like Fenwick, silence was always the safest thing. She stepped into the splendid dining room, where the crystal chandeliers were beginning to glow for the evening, and made a silent promise to herself. Tonight she would keep her head down and work as hard as she could. Tonight, no matter what happened, she absolutely mustn't cause any trouble. She would get home on time, she would read Toby the story about the brave little rabbit, and she would hold on to this job. She couldn't have known that on this very night, that promise would be placed on the scale, and she would have to choose between keeping it or holding on to something far more precious, as Della stepped into the dining room to begin her shift. Not far away, Ruth Delacroix was still standing silently outside the brass revolving door, with a storm of conflict inside her heart that she had carried through the whole long ride on the bus, because the joy of seeing her son on his birthday was not the only thing holding her heart captive that afternoon. There was also a dull, persistent worry, a worry she had never dared speak aloud to anyone, not even to herself during those long, sleepless nights. Her son had become wealthy, so wealthy that she couldn't begin to understand it. He sent her checks with numbers that made her hands tremble when she held them. He paid off all her old debts with a single phone call. He bought her a warm house and told her she must never worry about money again. But every time she asked him what kind of work he did to have all those things, he only smiled, an evasive smile, then told her he worked in real estate and investments, smooth words that she could feel were hiding something. Ruth wasn't a foolish woman. She had lived long enough, had passed through enough shadowed corners of life to recognize when something wasn't right. She saw the way men dressed in black were always waiting for her son a few steps away. She saw the way people lowered their voices and bowed their heads whenever they mentioned his name. She heard the vague rumors that old neighbors accidentally let slip, words they immediately swallowed the moment they realized she was standing nearby. And each small piece, when placed beside the others, formed a picture no mother ever wanted to believe. She was afraid that the little boy she had once lulled to sleep in that cramped rented room had now become a man she no longer recognized. She was afraid that the money keeping her alive now might have been stained by a kind of darkness her honest hands had never touched in all her life. She remembered the boy from years ago, the child who used to sit on the steps outside Dabney's waiting for his mother to finish her shift, the child who once told her that when he grew up, he would make so much money, she'd never have to wait tables for anyone again. Back then, she had only smiled and stroked his hair, thinking those were just the innocent words of a child. She had never imagined that he would truly keep that promise, even if it meant taking a road that made her heart ache every time she thought of it. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering whether it had been her poverty, whether it had been those years when she couldn't give her son a full and comfortable life, that had pushed him toward that path. That guilt was heavier than any tray of food she had ever carried in her life. That was why tonight, along with the tin box and the birthday dinner, Ruth carried something else inside her heart. She had decided that tonight, she would sit across from her son, look straight into his eyes and ask him for one thing. Not money, because she had never wanted that. She would ask him to stop, to leave behind whatever was holding him prisoner in the dark, to come back and begin again as a man she could proudly hold in her arms without fear. She tightened her grip on the box in her hands, drew in a deep breath, and placed her thin, bony palm against the cold revolving door to step inside. At the very moment that Mother placed her hand on the door, on the highest floor of a glass building, rising in the middle of the city's financial district, the son she worried over was sitting at the head of a long conference table made of gleaming walnut. Silas Delacroix was 34 years old, and he didn't need to raise his voice for the entire room to listen to every word he said. He was a tall, powerfully built man, his broad shoulders hidden beneath the fabric of a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and his face had been carved by time and difficult decisions into cold, resolute lines. His eyes were gray, and when those eyes came to rest on someone, that person felt as though he were being weighed on an invisible scale, whose verdict could decide his fate. Around that table sat powerful men who ran holdings spread across the city, and yet not one of them dared look directly at him for more than a few seconds. In that room, an older man was trying to explain a missing sum of money, the figures that didn't match in the books he had been entrusted to oversee. At first, his voice still carried a show of confidence, but the more he spoke, the more he realized that Silas wasn't interrupting him, wasn't showing anger, but was only watching him in silence with gray eyes so calm they sent a chill through the blood. It was that silence that was most frightening. When the other man finally stopped speaking, Silas merely tilted his head slightly, and in a quiet voice, almost gentle, he reminded him that trust was the most expensive asset a man could possess, and that once it was lost, there was no amount of money in the world that could buy it back. He didn't make a single threat, he didn't need to, but the older man's face went pale at once, sweat beading on his forehead, and his hands trembled so badly that he had to grip the edge of the table to hide it. The entire room sank into a thick, heavy silence, the kind of silence in which everyone held his breath and waited, because they all understood that behind the soft voice of the man seated at the head of the table was a power capable of erasing anyone with a mere flick of the hand. That was how Silas Delacroix ruled his underground empire. Not with shouting, not with loud displays of strength, but with an absolute composure that terrified people down to the bone. He had built all of this from nothing, from a boy who had grown up in poverty, and he protected it with an unforgiving hardness. People told stories about him in whispers. They said he owned half the most beautiful buildings in the city, that the finest restaurants and the most discreet clubs all rested beneath his shadow. And they said that no matter how wealthy and powerful he became, there was still one mystery about him that no one dared ask about, some silence in his eyes that money had never been able to fill. When the meeting ended, and the men left the room one by one with the hurried bearing of those who had just escaped a storm, Silas remained alone beside the long table. He slowly turned the silver ring on his finger, his gray eyes looking out through the glass window at the whole city, beginning to light up beneath him. It was then that the phone on the table gave a faint vibration. He lowered his eyes to the screen, and for a moment, the motionless coldness on his face changed. Because the name appearing there was the name of the manager of one of his restaurants, Maison Verdun, and that man called him only when something truly serious had happened. But before Silas could answer that call, he paused for a single beat, and his hand moved by habit to touch the small object he always carried with him, the thing tucked inside his breast pocket, right above his heart. It was an old key, tarnished with age, the key to the cramped rented room where he and his mother had lived through the poorest years of their lives. He had kept it for nearly his whole life, polishing it with his fingers whenever his heart wavered, because it was the last remaining fragment of the boy this world had once tried to crush. No one in his empire knew about that key. No one knew that the man who made an entire city tremble still clenched a relic in his hand night after night, from the days when he had owned nothing but hunger and humiliation. Silas hadn't been born into silk and privilege. He had grown up in a neighborhood where winter was cold enough to cut to the bone, and summer was so stifling it felt hard to breathe, where his mother went to work before the sky had even begun to brighten and didn't return until deep into the night. He remembered with perfect clarity the sight of his mother stepping through the door with swollen feet, her face marked by the exhaustion she always tried to hide behind a smile meant for her son. He remembered the nights when she counted every small coin and folded bill of tip money beneath a weak yellow lamp, calculating whether there was enough to pay that month's rent, whether there was enough to buy him a new pair of shoes when the old ones had split open at the toes. And he remembered, more clearly than anything else, the way the world looked at the two of them. He remembered the contempt in the eyes of people with money when his mother brought food to their table. He remembered the condescending tone of the landlord whenever she was even one day late with the rent. He remembered standing there, a helpless little boy, watching the woman he loved most in the world, being treated as though she didn't deserve to be human. It was those looks that had carved him into the man he was today. Once, when he was still a teenager, he had heard a wealthy man insult his mother in the middle of a public place, and she had only lowered her head and endured it, because she had no power with which to fight back. That night, young Silas lay awake until dawn, and in the darkness, he swore a vow to himself that he would chase for the rest of his life. He vowed that one day, he would become so powerful that no one, ever again, would dare look at his mother, or at anyone who carried his blood, with that kind of disdain. He vowed that he would build a wall of power so high the whole world would have to look up at it, so no one could ever touch the people he loved again. And that boy had kept his vow, but at a price he had never been able to foresee. The road that brought him to power was also the road that pulled him away from the decent man his mother had always hoped he would become. Silas looked down at the old key in his palm one last time, something very much like pain passing briefly through his gray eyes. Then he closed his fist around it, slipped it back into his pocket, and picked up the phone still vibrating on the table. At the other end of the line, in the magnificent dining hall of Maison Verdun, Gerald Fenwick had just hung up after leaving a brief message, then adjusted his tie and stepped out into the dining room with the stride of a man who believed the whole world had been created to serve him. He had managed this place for many years, since the days of the former owners, and when the restaurant was transferred to a new owner a few months ago, he was one of the few people kept on. But that new owner had never once set foot here. Every instruction came through intermediaries, cold phone calls, contracts signed from afar. Fenwick had never seen the face of the man who owned this place, and deep in his mind, he believed Maison Verdun was, in truth, his own private kingdom. He was the one who decided who could step inside, who had to remain outside, who deserved to sit beneath the glow of the crystal chandeliers, and who did not. To Fenwick, a person was measured by the things they wore. He could glance at a guest walking through the door and value them in an instant. From the watch on the wrist, the shoes on the feet, to the way they held the menu. With elegant guests, women wearing glittering jewelry and men dressed in expensive suits, his voice became as sweet as honey. His smile widened, and he bowed to welcome them with every bit of warmth he could put on display. But with those he believed did not belong in this place, people dressed simply, people he judged as not having enough money or not having enough class, that very same man instantly turned cold and cruel. He considered removing such people from the sight of distinguished diners to be part of his work, even a point of pride, because he believed that was exactly what preserved the gleaming splendor that drew the upper class to Maison Verdun. That afternoon, Fenwick made his rounds through the dining room, his sharp eyes sweeping across each table like a hunter inspecting his territory. He straightened a flower in a vase, gave a small snap of his fingers to signal an employee to wipe a streak of water from the floor, and stopped beside the tables of the most familiar guests to offer them the eager smile he reserved only for people with money. He paid special attention to a woman seated at the finest table by the window, Mrs. Priscilla Vane, a wealthy lady who often came here, someone he always tried to please because he knew that a single word of praise from her within her circle could bring the restaurant a dozen new guests. He bent down to ask about her appetizer, nodded along with everything she said, and told himself that tonight he would satisfy her at any cost. In Gerald Fenwick's mind at that moment, there was only one concern, and that was to keep this room perfect, elegant, and faithful to the image he wanted to build. He glanced at the trial employee named Rourke, as she carried a tray between the tables, silently reminding himself to keep an eye on her, then turned back to smile at another guest. He had no idea at all that in just a few minutes, a plainly dressed older woman would step through the restaurant's revolving door, and that the way he treated that woman would bring crashing down over his head everything he had worked so hard to build. And then the brass revolving door moved softly, and Ruth Delacroix stepped inside. She walked slowly, one hand resting on her wooden cane, the other still holding the tin box against her chest, and in the moment she set foot on the gleaming tile floor of the foyer, an entire unfamiliar world opened before her eyes. Crystal chandeliers hung down from the soaring ceiling, pouring golden light over tables covered in spotless white cloth, over delicate glasses that sparkled like dew, over the suits and evening gowns of the diners. The air carried a faint trace of expensive perfume, fine wine, and the gentle sound of piano music drifting from a corner of the room. All of it was so beautiful, and so distant that she almost forgot her own feet had once stood on this very ground for years. Back when it was still a shabby little diner, Ruth stopped at the threshold, and for a moment she suddenly felt very small. The gray sweater she wore was old, frayed at the elbows, carefully washed and folded by her for many years. The shoes on her feet were flat orthopedic shoes, the kind worn by someone who valued comfort more than appearance. In the middle of this splendid room, she appeared like a misplaced mark, a plain patch sewn onto a brocade cloth embroidered with gold thread. A few guests seated near the door glanced up at her, their eyes briefly showing surprise. Then they looked away and continued their conversations as though she didn't exist at all. But Ruth didn't falter under those looks. She had lived too long to allow them to wound her. She lifted her head, drew in a deep breath, and told herself that tonight she had come here as a proper mother treating her son to dinner, and she deserved to stand here as much as anyone else in this room. From across the dining room, Della Rourke was setting a tray of drinks down on a table when she caught sight of the older woman who had just stepped inside. There was something about the woman's bearing that made Della's hand pause midway. Perhaps it was the way she held the tin box so tightly, as though afraid someone might snatch it away. Perhaps it was the worn old sweater that reminded Della of her late grandmother. Or perhaps it was simply the gaze of someone who had lived through many hardships, the same kind of gaze Della met every morning when she looked at herself in the mirror. She watched the old woman standing alone and out of place amid the luxurious room, and a quiet compassion rose inside her, the kind of feeling only those who had once been looked down on by the world could truly understand. She wanted to walk over, wanted to ask what the woman needed, wanted to find her a warm table by the window. But just as Della was about to step forward, she suddenly remembered the promise she had made to herself when she began her shift, remembered Fenwick's cold, sharp eyes and the rent notice lying at the bottom of her coat pocket. She hesitated, the drink tray still heavy in her hands, and in that moment of uncertainty, she saw the older woman move toward the host stand, where an employee was waiting. The old woman bowed her head slightly in greeting and asked, in a humble and polite voice, whether she might be given a table for two, because she was waiting for her son to come have dinner with her. Della stood silently watching, her heart telling her to do something, while reason held her feet in place, and she couldn't have known that in just a few short minutes, that hesitation would disappear, and she would be forced to choose. The host was still flustered, not knowing how to answer the old woman, when from the finest table by the window, Mrs. Priscilla Vane set her wineglass down with a soft but deliberate clink. She was a woman in her 40s, dressed in an expensive silk gown, with a gleaming strand of pearls around her neck and blonde hair curled carefully into place. She looked Ruth up and down, her red painted lips lifting slightly into an expression that was part surprise and part disgust, as though she had just discovered something improper staining the clean air around her. She turned to the friend seated at her table, deliberately lowering her voice, but still speaking loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, and remarked that it was simply unbelievable that a place as refined as Maison Verdun could now allow just anyone to shuffle in from the street, that she paid generous sums to enjoy an atmosphere worthy of her, not to be forced to sit beside people like that. Priscilla Vane raised a hand in signal, and within an instant, Gerald Fenwick was at her table, bending forward with his usual eager smile. She didn't need to say much. She merely glanced toward the older woman standing by the host stand, then sighed and complained that the old woman's presence was ruining her entire evening, that she had come here for elegance, not to witness a scene like this, and that she trusted a capable manager like Fenwick certainly understood what had to be done to preserve the class of his restaurant. Every word she spoke came the sugary voice of a woman, accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, and each one fell into Fenwick's ear like a command he was eager to carry out. In Fenwick's mind, a cold calculation immediately took shape. This was exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to win favor in the eyes of a distinguished guest like Priscilla Vane, to prove that he was a devoted guardian of the class that people like her valued. He glanced at the older woman beside the host stand, at her worn gray sweater and the tin box she held tightly against her chest, and in the eyes with which he measured human worth, that old woman was nothing more than a stain that needed to be wiped away as quickly as possible. He didn't bother to find out who she was, why she had come here, or what she was waiting for. To him, the answer had been clear from the very first look. She didn't belong here, and it was his duty to take her outside. He gave Priscilla Vane a slight nod, promising with a smile that she wouldn't have to trouble herself for another second, then straightened, adjusted the front of his suit jacket, and began walking toward the old woman with decisive steps. Several diners at the surrounding tables had begun to notice what was happening. Conversation softened. Curious eyes followed the manager as he strode across the room. Della, standing close to a column nearby, felt that something wrong was drawing near. She saw the look on Fenwick's face, the look she had learned to recognize, the look he always wore when he was about to pour his cruelty onto someone weaker than himself. And her heart began to beat faster, because she knew, with an instinct so clear it hurt, that the person about to suffer that cruelty was the gentle old woman standing by the host stand, waiting for her son. Before anyone could intervene, Fenwick roughly brushed past the host stand, his arm intentionally striking the worn tin box in Ruth's fragile grip. The box slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the hard floor as the lid popped open, scattering decades of her hard-earned coins and private memories across the polished tiles. The sudden impact forced the weak old woman down to her knees in panic. Standing close to the column, Della Rourke had seen everything, and inside her chest, a silent battle was unfolding within the brief span of a single breath. She saw the old woman kneeling on the cold tile floor. She saw the loose coins rolling beneath the feet of an uncaring crowd, and something in her heart twisted painfully. But at the same time, another voice rose inside her mind, the voice of fear and responsibility. She thought of Toby, of his smile missing one baby tooth, of the promise to read him a story every night. She thought of the rent notice lying at the bottom of her coat pocket, of the fragile line between having a roof over their heads and sleeping under the open sky. She knew very well what would happen if she stepped forward. Fenwick would fire her on the spot, without hesitation, and she and her son would lose the only thing still keeping them upright. All she had to do was lower her head. All she had to do was turn away and pretend she hadn't seen. Then she would keep her job and keep her son safe. That was the wisest thing to do. That was what reason told her. But then her eyes met the face of the older woman kneeling on the floor, and in that woman's eyes, Della saw something that made it impossible for her to look away. She saw herself there. She saw every time the world had looked down on her, every time she had been treated as though she didn't deserve respect, simply because she was poor. She realized that if she stayed silent tonight, she would never again be able to look straight into her son's eyes and teach him about kindness and courage. And so, before reason could hold her back one more time, her feet had already begun to move. She set the tray she was holding onto an empty table, crossed the dining room, and went straight to the old woman. She knelt beside Ruth, gently took her by the elbow, and helped the trembling old woman back to her feet. Shielding her before they could even gather the scattered items from the floor, she softly told her, in a voice warm enough for only the old woman to hear, that she shouldn't worry, that she was here, that everything would be all right. Ruth looked up at the young face of the stranger kneeling beside her, and a look of astonishment flickered in her aged eyes, because in the middle of an entire sea of indifference, this was the first hand that had reached out toward her. Then Della stood, and she did the thing she knew would change everything. She took one step forward, placed herself between the old woman and the manager, and lifted her head to face Fenwick. Fenwick's face darkened at once with shock and fury. He couldn't believe that a lowly trial employee would have the nerve to block his way in front of the entire dining room and in front of the important guest he was trying to please. He glared at her, and in his smooth, venomous voice, ordered her to step aside immediately, warning her that if she kept interfering in this matter, she could forget about her job altogether. But Della didn't step aside. She stood firm, her arms slightly spread as if to shield the woman behind her, and in a voice that trembled but didn't falter, she answered that the old woman hadn't done anything wrong, that she only wanted a table and a decent meal, and that no one deserved to be treated the way he had just treated her. Fenwick moved closer, and now all his rage shifted onto the girl who dared defy him. He lowered his voice into something cold and cutting, saying that he had seen from the beginning that she was no better than that woman, that a dirt-poor girl defending a ragged old woman made quite the perfect pair, and that both of them ought to get the hell out of this place together. The phones kept recording, and now, in the middle of that magnificent dining room, two women who had been strangers, one old and one young, stood shoulder to shoulder like comrades on the same battle line, enduring humiliation before so many watching eyes, without knowing that the person who would bring all of this to an end was about to step through the door. What Gerald Fenwick didn't know was that only a few minutes earlier, one of the restaurant's older servers, a man who had worked in this place since it was still the old diner, had recognized the old woman's face. He had met her before, had heard stories about her, and when he witnessed the scene unfolding before him, a cold terror ran down his spine. He quietly backed into a hidden corner, took out his phone, and with trembling fingers, dialed a number very few people in this city possessed. He managed only to whisper a few brief sentences into the phone, saying that something bad was happening to a woman at Maison Verdun. That sir needed to come at once. And at the other end of the line, the man who had just heard those words immediately rose to his feet, left everything behind, and rushed down to the car waiting for him. The brass revolving door moved softly, and Silas Delacroix stepped inside. He did not appear hurried, at least not on the surface, because his entire life had taught him how to hide the storm inside him, behind a shell of absolute calm. He stopped at the threshold, slowly removed his leather gloves one finger at a time, and his gray eyes swept across the room. There was something in his stillness, in the way he stood there while the whole space seemed to sink lower around him, that made the nearest waiter instinctively take one step back. Then his gaze stopped. He saw a young woman spreading her arms to protect someone behind her, and he saw behind that young woman a silver-haired woman standing there trembling, holding an old tin box against her chest, a box he recognized from the very first glance, the box he had seen throughout his entire childhood. In that moment, time seemed to stop for Silas. The whole room, all the crystal lights, all the unfamiliar people, everything faded away, and he could see only one person. He began to walk, and each step of his sounded against the tile floor amid the silence, slowly falling over the dining room. He crossed the rows of tables covered in spotless white cloth, past the knives and forks pausing halfway in midair, past the curious eyes beginning to follow him. Fenwick, seeing the man in the expensive suit coming toward him, immediately shifted into his familiar sweet voice, offering a welcome to the elegant guest, and beginning to explain that he was handling a small nuisance. But Silas didn't even look at him. He swept past him as though he didn't exist, went straight to the old woman, and stopped right in front of her. Then the man who made an entire city tremble, the man who had never revealed the slightest weakness before anyone, sank down onto one knee on the tile floor before the silver-haired woman. His cold gray eyes now shimmered with something no one had ever imagined could exist inside him, and he spoke a single word, hoarse and broken as though it had been pulled from the very bottom of a child's heart, a child who had lost his mother a very long time ago. He called her Mom. That call fell into the dining room like a stone dropping onto the surface of a still lake, and the entire space went dead silent in an instant. Ruth looked up, and when she recognized the face of her son kneeling at her feet, her lips trembled, and the tin box nearly slipped from her hands. Della stood rooted in place, looking from the powerful man to the old woman she had just protected, and in her mind, every scattered piece began fitting together into a picture that left her stunned. And Gerald Fenwick, standing frozen in the middle of the dining room, with the smile not yet faded from his lips, felt an icy current run down his spine as he began to dimly understand that the woman he had just humiliated was not a nobody, and that he had perhaps just made the most terrible mistake of his entire life. The name of that man began to spread through the dining room like fire running across the surface of oil. The older server, the one who had made the call, whispered something to the coworker standing beside him, and in the blink of an eye, those whispers passed from one person to another, from one table to the next, faster and faster. That was the owner. That was the very man who owned this restaurant, the man who owned the buildings around it, the man whose name everyone had heard but no one had ever dared mention more than once. And when that name reached Gerald Fenwick's ears, all the blood seemed to drain from his face in a single instant. The eager smile still lingering on his lips froze, then vanished, replaced by naked terror. His knees nearly buckled, his hand grabbed the back of a nearby chair to keep himself from falling, and inside his head, every cruel word he had just poured onto the silver-haired woman now echoed back like sentences he had pronounced upon himself. Across the dining room, a silent but violent shift was taking place. The servers who had been clustered together, watching, now lowered their heads all at once and hurried back to their positions, none of them daring to look directly at the man kneeling beside the old woman. At the finest table by the window, Priscilla Vane, who only moments ago had been raising her voice to complain and give orders, now quietly lowered the phone she had been holding up beneath the table, trying to hide it as though it were evidence of a crime. Her arrogant face had gone pale, her jeweled hands trembled slightly, and she bent her head toward her wineglass, no longer daring to look toward the old woman she had despised just minutes before. Fear moved through the room as quickly as a cold wind, touching each person and making them shrink back. At the tables farther away, a few guests began to stand quietly. They didn't say a word. They only placed money on the table, hurriedly put on their coats, and left the restaurant with steps as quick and light as possible, as though they feared that even the smallest sound would be enough to turn that man's gaze toward them. The phones that only moments earlier had been greedily recording the old woman's humiliation had all disappeared now, shoved quickly into coat pockets and handbags, because no one in this room still had enough courage to point a lens at that man. The indifferent crowd that had stood watching an old woman kneel on the floor, without the slightest stirring of pity, now trembled before the presence of a power they had only just recognized. That was the strangest and most bitter thing about this moment. Fenwick's cruelty, the crowd's indifference, all of it hadn't shifted at all when it was poured onto a woman who seemed to have nothing with which to defend herself. Yet now, just one word, mother, just the appearance of a man powerful enough to terrify them, was enough to make the entire room change its attitude completely. Not because they had suddenly realized they were wrong, but because they had suddenly realized the price that mistake might cost them. And while the whole room sank into that speechless fear, the man kneeling beside his mother slowly rose to his feet, and his gray eyes finally turned toward Gerald Fenwick. Silas straightened, and when his gray eyes came to rest on Gerald Fenwick's face, the entire dining room seemed to hold its breath. He did not raise his voice. He did not move closer with threatening gestures. He simply stood there, motionless, and that stillness was more frightening than any loud outburst of rage could have been. Inside him, the monster he had spent his whole life holding back was rising, roaring to be set free, because he had just seen with his own eyes the very thing he had sworn he would never allow to happen again. He had seen his mother kneeling on the cold tile floor, gathering one small coin after another beneath the indifferent eyes of the crowd. He had seen the exact scene from his childhood, the scene that had haunted him for so many years, and had turned him into the man he was today. And the only thing keeping him from lunging forward was the presence of the woman standing behind him. He spoke, and his voice was low, slow, so cold that every word seemed to freeze in the air. He asked Fenwick whether he knew who the woman he had just humiliated was. Fenwick stammered, trying to force out an apology, his lips trembling so badly that he couldn't form a sentence. But Silas didn't give him the chance. He told him that this woman had spent her whole life wiping down tables exactly like the ones in this room, had carried trays for people who looked at her with the very same eyes Fenwick had just thrown at her, and that she had done all of it with a dignity that 100 men like Fenwick put together would never possess. Not a single curse passed through Silas's lips, yet each word cut into Fenwick more deeply than any blade, because they laid bare the naked truth of what he was. Then Silas continued, and this time his voice grew colder with every word. He reminded Fenwick that the restaurant he had imagined was his own private kingdom, the place he used to decide who was worthy and who was not, in fact belonged to him, every brick, every glass, every dollar of salary Fenwick received each month. He said that with one word right now, he could make sure Fenwick never set foot inside any restaurant in this city again, not as a manager, not even as a guest. He could make the name Gerald Fenwick become a name no one in this world would dare hire, dare mention, or dare be connected to. He didn't need to raise a hand against him. He only needed to pick up the phone, and the entire glittering world Fenwick had spent his life trying to worm his way into would slam its doors in his face forever. Fenwick sagged, leaning fully against the chair beside him, his face as white as paper. He began to beg, his voice breaking pitifully, saying that he hadn't known, that he had only been doing his job, that please, sir, spare him just this once. But those pleas only exposed his nature more clearly, because everyone could hear that he wasn't sorry for humiliating an old woman. He was only sorry that the old woman had turned out to be the mother of the most powerful man he had ever met. Silas looked at him writhing before him, and for a moment his gray eyes darkened dangerously, the monster inside him reaching the very edge of eruption. He took one step toward Fenwick, and the whole dining room seemed to shrink back, waiting for the worst to happen. But in that very instant, when his anger had risen to its highest point, when he was about to speak the command that would crush the life of the man standing before him, he suddenly felt a thin, warm, trembling hand settle on his arm. It was his mother's hand. And that single gentle touch was enough to make the roaring monster inside him stop short. Silas turned back, and when his eyes met his mother's face, the storm roaring inside him suddenly fell still. Ruth looked at her son with eyes that had witnessed too many winters of life, and in those eyes there was no satisfaction, no hunger for revenge, only a sorrow so deep it seemed endless, and a love without shore. She gently tightened her hand around his arm, and in a soft but clear voice, quiet enough for him yet strong enough to be heard in the stillness of the room, she told him to stop. She said she hadn't come here, hadn't traveled all this long way, only to witness her son become a man she no longer recognized. She said she knew he had enough power to crush the man kneeling on the floor, but that was exactly what hurt her heart the most. That was the moment when the worry she had hidden for so many years finally broke open into words. She told her son, her voice catching, that she had always wondered what kind of man he had become, that she had lain awake through so many long nights, fearing for the soul of the little boy she had once lulled to sleep in that poor rented room. She said she didn't need a son who could make an entire city tremble. She had never needed that. The only thing she had ever longed for was the little boy who used to sit on the steps waiting for his mother to finish her shift, the child with a warm and decent heart. She told him that if tonight he used his power to destroy a person, then no matter how much that person deserved punishment, he would lose another piece of the man she had always loved, and she couldn't bear that thought anymore. Silas stood silent, and his mother's words landed inside him more heavily than anything he had ever heard. The man who had never bowed his head before anyone, who had never allowed any words to move him, now stood there with his shoulders trembling slightly, because he knew his mother was right. He had spent his whole life building a wall of power, believing he was doing it to protect her, and yet only now did he realize that the very wall had pushed him farther and farther away from the man she had hoped he would become. He had wanted to make sure no one ever dared look down on his family again, but he had never once asked himself whether his mother was happy with the price paid for it. Ruth slowly turned toward Gerald Fenwick, who was still shrinking beside the chair, and she looked at him with a gaze that unsettled him even more than anger could have, because there was no hatred in that gaze. She told him, in the calm voice of someone who had lived through too much hurt to wish to cause more hurt to anyone else, that she forgave him. But then she added, each word sinking deep like a lesson, that her forgiveness didn't mean what he had done was right, and that a real apology wasn't something a person said when he was cornered and when cameras were pointed at him. A real apology, she said, was something people proved by changing the way they treated others, especially those who couldn't bring them any benefit at all. Those words made Fenwick lower his face, and for the first time all evening, something truly stirred in his eyes, a shame he could no longer deny. The whole room sank into silence, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed something greater than power, something very few of them had ever seen in their lives. Silas lowered himself down, kneeling on the tile floor in the middle of the magnificent dining room, and began picking up each item that had spilled from his mother's tin box. He gathered the old worn coins one by one, coins he recognized at once as tip money, the kind of money his mother had earned through long nights standing on swollen feet. He counted them in his palm, and something tightened inside his chest when he understood that this wasn't pocket change, but something that had been saved, cherished, and carried through all those years. His hand stopped when it touched a yellowed photograph lying face down on the tile. He turned it over, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a photograph of a young woman wearing an old waitress uniform, holding a little boy of about 2 years old in her arms, both mother and child smiling at the camera, with the faded neon sign of a diner called Dabney's behind them. That woman was his mother when she was young. That little boy was him. But the thing that truly broke Silas was lying beneath the photograph. It was a letter, carefully folded, the paper yellowed and softened from being opened and folded again countless times over all those years. He opened it with trembling hands, and he recognized his mother's handwriting at once, that slanted script she had written more than 30 years ago. The letter had been written in the year he had just turned 2, during the darkest days after his father had left, when she didn't know whether the two of them would survive that winter. In the letter, that young mother had written to the son who couldn't yet read, writing as if sending a promise into the future, saying that no matter how cruel life became, no matter how hard she had to work until she was exhausted, She would never let him go hungry, would never leave him. She wrote that she couldn't give him wealth, but she would give him something more precious than that. She would teach him to live with kindness, to hold his head high without needing to trample anyone beneath his feet, because that was the true richness no one could ever steal from him. Silas read each line of that letter, kneeling in the middle of the dining room before so many watching eyes, and the man who made an entire city tremble began to cry, not the silent kind of tears a person tries to hold back, but the tears of a son who had walked too far from the road his mother had hoped for him, and now, far too late, finally realized what he had lost. He reached up and touched his breast pocket, where he kept the old key to the rented room from long ago, the keepsake he had carried his whole life as a reminder of where he had begun. And now, as he placed his mother's letter beside that key in his mind, he understood that both of them were fragments of the same story, the story of a mother who had sacrificed everything, and a son who had misunderstood that sacrifice for so many years. He looked up at his mother, and through his tears, he spoke words he had never said to anyone. He said that he had done all of this for her, that he had become strong and powerful, so no one would ever dare look down on her again, so she would never have to kneel before anyone. Ruth lifted her thin hand and stroked her son's hair, exactly the way she had done when he was still a little boy. And through her own tears, she told him that she had never needed him to be that strong. She only needed him to keep the kind heart she had given him from the moment he was born. She said it was time for her son to open this box, not so he could see the money, but so he could read the promise she had entrusted to him before he even knew how to speak, and so he could understand that it was never too late to return to being the son she had always loved. Silas rose to his feet, carefully folded the letter again, and placed it back inside the tin box with the photograph and the coins. Then he handed the box back to his mother with both hands, as though he were holding the most precious treasure in the world. After that, he turned toward Gerald Fenwick, who was still standing there with a pale face, waiting for the judgment meant for him. The entire dining room held its breath, because everyone knew that with only one word from this man, the manager's life would be finished. But Silas was no longer the man he had been a few minutes earlier. He looked at Fenwick for a long while, then said, in a voice that had softened but still carried weight, that he would no longer work here, that his position as manager of Maison Verdun was over from this very moment. It was an inevitable consequence, a fair price for what he had done, not an act of revenge. Fenwick lowered his head and accepted it, and in his heart, perhaps he had prepared himself for something far worse. But then Ruth herself spoke. She stepped forward, placed her hand on her son's arm once more, and asked him to give the man who had just humiliated her one chance. She said that losing this job was something he had to bear, but she didn't want to see his life destroyed completely, didn't want her son to use his power to slam every door in his face forever. She said that if a person was never given a chance to make things right, then he would never learn how to become better, and the endless circle of contempt and hurt would simply continue without end. She looked straight into Fenwick's eyes and said she hoped he would use what happened tonight to look back at himself, not to carry more hatred. Her words made the whole room fall silent, and made Gerald Fenwick himself lift his head and look at her with an astonishment that was hard to describe. The woman he had treated with the greatest cruelty, the woman he had pushed to the point of kneeling on the floor to gather her things, was the only person in that room who stood up to ask for a path forward for him. Something inside him broke open before that kindness, a kindness he had never thought he deserved to receive. His lips moved, and this time, the apology that came out of his mouth sounded completely different from the pitiful begging from before. It was smaller, more trembling, but more real. He apologized to her, not because he was afraid, but because for the first time, he truly saw the human being he had hurt. Silas stood silently, watching all of it, and inside him a deep transformation was taking place. He looked at his mother, the small woman who had just been trampled without mercy, now standing there offering mercy to the very man who had humiliated her, and he suddenly understood the difference between his power and her strength. All his life, he had believed strength lay in the ability to make others afraid, in being able to crush anyone who dared stand in his way. But now, standing in the middle of this dining room, he understood that the strongest person he had ever known was the mother who had never possessed a bit of power, the woman who had won not through fear, but through forgiveness. He looked back at the road he had walked for so many years, a road paved with other people's fear, and for the first time, he wondered whether that was truly the road he wanted to keep walking. In his mother's eyes, he saw not an empire, not power, but only a simple invitation to return to being the son she had always believed in. In the days after that night, Silas Delacroix did something no one in his empire could have expected. Instead of allowing Maison Verdon to remain a fortress of luxury and arrogance, he decided to turn it into something entirely different. According to his mother's wishes, he opened the restaurant every Monday evening, not to serve wealthy guests, but to set out hot, decent meals for anyone in the city who was struggling, for the homeless, for poor laborers, for the very people who, in the past, might have been driven out the door by Fenwick himself. He named the program after his mother, and he said it was a way to remind everyone that a person deserved to be treated with dignity, not because of the things they wore, but simply because they were human. Silas did even more than that. He established a mandatory training program for every employee at all the restaurants he owned, and the first thing each person was taught was not how to pour wine, or how to fold a napkin beautifully, but how to look at every guest who stepped through the door with the same respect, whether that person was wearing an expensive suit or a sweater frayed at the seams. He told them the story of his mother, of the woman who had spent her life standing on the other side of the table, and he wanted every employee to understand that the person they had just treated coldly could be someone's mother, could be someone's whole world. In that way, the painful story of one night became the seed of something good that would continue spreading far into the future. And amid all those changes, Silas did not forget the young woman who had dared to step forward and protect his mother when no one else in that crowded room had dared to do so. He had someone look into Della Rourke, and when he learned about her circumstances, about the 2 jobs she was carrying on her shoulders, about her little boy and the overdue rent notice, his admiration for her courage only deepened. Because he understood that when she stepped forward to defend his mother, she had placed her own child's food and shelter on the scale. She had no power to protect herself, no one standing behind her to call upon, and yet she still chose to do what was right. That was the most precious kind of courage, the kind of courage that didn't come from strength, but from the heart. Silas did not repay her by throwing a large sum of money at her and then forgetting about her, because he understood that doing so would wound the pride of someone like her. Instead, he offered her the role of the new manager of Maison Verdon, the position Fenwick had left behind. He told her that he needed someone who understood what it meant to be looked down on, to build a place where no one would ever be treated that way again, and that he couldn't find anyone more deserving of that work than her. Della burst into tears when she heard those words, not because of the job or because of the salary that would completely change her and her son's life, but because for the first time in her life, her kindness had been seen and cherished. Several weeks later, on the first Monday evening of the charitable meal program, the dining room of Maison Verdon glowed in an entirely different way. Della stood in the middle of the restaurant as its new manager during the Monday evening charity shifts, and beside her, little Toby was running happily between the tables, his giggles ringing through a room that had once been so cold. The boy ran over and wrapped his arms around his mother's legs, proudly showing her the new picture he had just drawn, and Della picked him up and spun him around, both mother and child laughing together. At a nearby table, Ruth sat quietly watching the scene, the tin box placed neatly beside her, and on her lips was a peaceful smile she hadn't had in a very long time. If that night left something lingering in our hearts, then perhaps it wasn't the cry of mother that made an entire dining room fall deathly still, nor was it the moment a powerful empire bowed itself before an old tin box. What remained most deeply, what kept us thinking long after, was the image of dozens of people inside that magnificent room. People who silently lifted their phones to record an old woman being humiliated, while not one of them was willing to step forward. They all saw the wrong taking place. They all had feet with which to move closer, lips with which to speak up. But every one of them waited for someone else to be brave in their place, waited for someone else to carry the risk they themselves didn't want to bear. And in that whole sea of indifference, only one person stepped out. Ruth Delacroix was finally saved, but we mustn't forget that she was saved because she had a son powerful enough to make an entire city show fear and respect. because there was a phone number someone could call when everything became unbearable. Yet how many people are out there who, when they are pushed down to their knees, have no one to call, no powerful arm reaching out to help them stand again? Della Rourke had no power at all. She had no empire standing behind her, no name that made people tremble. She could even have lost everything because of what she chose to do, and still she spoke up. And that is exactly the kind of courage this world needs more than ever. The kind of courage that doesn't wait until we are strong enough, safe enough, before daring to do what is right. The lesson left behind by the story of that night is simple yet profound, that a person's dignity is never measured by the clothes they wear or the money in their pocket, that goodness and kindness are the most precious possessions of all, something no power can buy and no hardship can steal, and that sometimes just one person daring to step out of the crowd is enough to light a flame that can change an entire life. Each of us in this life will one day stand before a moment like that, a moment when we must choose between turning away to stay safe or stepping forward to protect what is right. And when that moment comes, may we have enough courage to become that voice, the voice that rises in the room before anyone powerful ever appears. If the story of Ruth, of Silas, and of Della's courage has touched something in your heart tonight, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love, so together we can listen to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about this story, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment below and tell us what moved your heart, because every sincere word you share from the depths of your heart is a precious source of encouragement for us to keep bringing you stories that touch the soul. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness filling each day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.